It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to 2019 Zaleski Lecture. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert, I'm Professor of Government and the Director of the Center. Zaleski Lecture was established in 1983, and it was a generous gift from the family of August Zaleski to organize meetings on Polish culture and politics. August Zaleski was an eminent Polish politician, and he was a scholar, he was a diplomat, he was a president of the Polish government in exile. So that lecture is designed to honor him and it provides a platform at Harvard for discussing Polish affairs. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Anna Grzymała-Busse today. Anna received PhD from Harvard University, from Department of Government some times ago. So Anu, welcome back home. Anna Grzymała-Busse is Professor of International Studies at Stanford University. She's also a Senior Fellow at the Spongler Institute for International Studies at Stanford, and she's a Senior Fellow at the Center for European Studies. Before moving to Stanford, Anna was Professor of Political Science at Michigan University Ann Arbor and at Yale University. Her research interests include political parties, state development and transformation, informal political institutions, religion and politics, and post-communist politics. She published widely in all those subfields, and she is the author of 3 prize-winning books, Redeeming the Communist Past, Rebuilding Leviathan, and most recently, Nations Under God. After Anna's talk, our dear colleague and friend Bart Bonikowski will offer some short comment. Bart is Associate Professor of Sociology at Harvard University and the resident faculty at the Center for European Studies. He's a cultural and political sociologist, and his research focuses on nationalism and populism in Europe and in the United States. Bart published widely in the most prestigious social science journals in the US and Europe. So I'm very glad that you agreed to join Anna. Now I would like to thank the staff of the CES for their work for preparing this event. And after the lecture, we have a reception upstairs to which you are all invited. Now, it's my great pleasure to give floor to you, Anna.
Thank you very much. It's an enormous pleasure to be back. I feel a bit like a prodigal daughter coming back to CES. It's also lovely to be here, not least because this is the one place where I can count that my last name will be pronounced correctly, which is a rare pleasure. So today I'll be talking about Poland in the global wave of populism. And this will basically be presenting some research from a large-scale project on populism that I'm conducting at Stanford. Now, populism is a word that we've all been hearing for the last several years, most notably for the last 3 years or so. If you look at Google Trends, which is a measure of how often these terms are Googled, you can see these spikes that show up at the Brexit referendum, at the election of President Trump, and at his inauguration. And so this is a term that's being bandied about quite a bit. Accordingly, this has garnered both scholarly interest. There's been a sort of a cottage industry of scholarship on populism, as well as media attention as the phenomenon spreads across the world. In some cases, the attempts have verged on desperation. I'm not sure if Bono is the best expert. So today, I'll try and cut through some of that confusion and basically talk about 3 different points. The first of these is, what is populism? Secondly, what are its roots? Where does it come from? And third, what are its consequences? How does this matter? And I'll be using Poland to show how Poland exemplifies these trends, and how in some cases it offers a counterpoint to what is otherwise a very similar wave sweeping the world. So first, what's populism? Well, populist parties and politicians basically make two claims. And this is a definition that's basically been now accepted widely in the social sciences. It follows from Katzmude. And so basically the claim is that elites are corrupt, that they're basically a self-serving elite cartel, that they're in it, whether it's journalists or politicians or academics, they're in it for themselves. The second claim that all populist politicians and parties make is that as a result, their people are unrepresented. And what we need instead is the representation of the popular will, of sort of the national spirit of the popular common good. The implications of this are twofold. One is that liberal democratic institutions are not to be trusted. After all, these are the creatures, the handmaidens of these corrupt elites that only serve them. And secondly, before they can be served, the people have to be defined. And it's those two implications. From those two implications, so many of the consequences of populism for democracy follow. Now, this is basically a biting criticism of politics as usual, and parties espousing these views have really taken off in Europe. If you look at the bottom line here, the green line is basically the average support for populist parties in the old member countries of the European Union, the established democracies. And you can see that it basically stays on, below 5%, until the 1990s, where it basically starts to steadily climb and more than triples by this year. In the new member countries, the new sort of newer democracies, you see levels of populist support that start off at a much higher level, around 22%, and then go up to close to 35 as of this last year. And in East Central Europe, the irony here is that these early success stories of Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland are precisely where we see the greatest populist takeoff, where these parties move from being, there we go, sorry, more visuals, where these parties move from, on one hand, being basically the margins of politics in the 1990s to becoming central to politics, often entering government and governing. And so we move from basically the young, scruffy revolutionaries of 1989 that so charmed observers at the time, to the bloated, jaundiced plutocrats of the 2000s. In both cases, that was Viktor Orban, the leader in Hungary of Fidesz, the party of young Democrats, which basically became a conservative populist party in the 1990s. And in the last three elections has governed with a constitutional supermajority of 2/3 of the seats in the Hungarian parliament. And that was in 2010, 2014, and most recently last year. In the Czech Republic, we have the action of dissatisfied citizens, with Andrej Babiš as a Trump-like figure, who won 30% and became the prime minister in 2017, largely on the strength of his criticism of the corruption of the elites and of parliament as and I quote, a talking shop. And finally, we have PiS, the Law and Justice Party, here led by Jarosław Kaczyński. The crown on his head is purely coincidental. This is a party that is conservative and populist from the start, and in the last two elections has won over half of the seats in parliament, which means that for the first time, a party could govern without a coalition partner. It could govern by itself. And so as we can see, basically, this is sort of a massive takeoff, right? We see these parties now enter government, and they're dominating politics in these sort of early reform success stories. So what are the causes of this? Why is it that populism has taken off both in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe? What could have led to sort of this profound sea change in the politics of these countries? Well, social scientists are a creative lot, and so they've come up with three different explanations that I'll examine and offer a fourth as an alternative. So these basically focus on economics, on immigration, on international influence, and what I will argue is the more important factor, political party competition. So first, there's the economy. The argument here goes that the austerity that followed the crises in 2008 and 2010 basically leads people both to sort of fear for their economic safety and to sort of seek out some kind of a Band-Aid for their economic woes. And the story goes that basically populist parties offer this, and as a result, they're the ones who get elected into power. But there are three problems with this story. The first of this is that the rise of populism predates this economic crisis. It starts long before we see this sort of break in economic conditions. Secondly, we see places where there's an economic crisis, but there's no populism, places like Portugal or Ireland. And conversely, we see places when there's no economic crisis, but nonetheless, populists arise in popularity. These are places like Finland and Poland. So we can next turn to immigration. And immigration poses a sort of a twin threat to sort of politics as usual in Europe. The first of this is that it offers sort of labor and welfare competition. Immigrants compete for jobs. They also compete for housing, for schooling, for places in hospitals, and so on. And at the same time, it also offers a cultural threat. Immigration basically is a challenge to sort of pre-establish or sort of establish cultural identities and to existing sort of national stories. And as a result, what we sometimes view as a humanitarian tragedy or a moral imperative, the 1.5 million refugees who came in 2015, is viewed by its critics as a menace to cultural homogeneity and the economic stability of Europe. And the story here is that the populist surge is a response to this recent immigration crisis. But once again, what we can see is that the relationship far predates what basically happens in the refugee crisis of 2015. There's a much sort of steadier relationship on the one hand between populist support and the migrant population. And while there is this relationship, places like Poland show us that it's simply not straightforward. There's no simple direct relationship between immigration and populism. In Poland, for example, what we see is that Poland accepted minimal numbers of refugees in 2015. There were no refugees there to sort of compete or to offer a cultural threat. At the same time, there was a much earlier, larger wave of Ukrainian immigrants that came after 2003, 2004, over 1.5 million immigrants that were largely incorporated and caused no backlash at all. So once again, the story of immigration and populism is not a simple or straightforward one. So that brings us to a third explanation on the international aspects of populism, which is exemplified, but not limited to, of course, Vladimir Putin. And Putin, of course, has led multiple efforts to support populists, whether it's the propaganda efforts of Russia Today, Sputnik, the Twitter and Facebook bots, the financing of politicians and parties in France and in Italy, the kind of non-aggression pacts that he signed with parties in Austria or in Italy, or the kind of internet interference that he's been running in the United States, in England and elsewhere. It's clear that he's had an impact. And Putin's basic goal in doing this is basically to destabilize the Western alliance, to erode the democracies in both the United States and Europe, or as he prefers to call it, the union of incestual homosexuals. So here, Poland once again offers an exception. Because on the one hand, there are some allegations that in 2013, 14, it was the FSB that basically the secret intelligence, the intelligence services of Russia, that helped to tape opposition then government politicians and basically led to their downfall. So there are some allegations like that. But culturally, politicians in Poland are far more hostile to Putin and to Russia than they would be in Hungary or elsewhere. And no one basically is currying favor publicly with Russia. So even if Russia would want to help, it's not clear that this help is welcomed. Moreover, even if Russia wanted to help populist parties, it couldn't do so unless these populist parties existed in the first place. So once again, this might be a facilitating condition, but it's certainly not the main explanation. So as a result, what I argue instead is that what we're looking at here is the failure of mainstream political parties. These are the centrist parties of governance that we're all very familiar with. In Western Europe, they're the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. They're the parties of the center left and the center right. And where these parties weaken, populists prosper. And what's happened, basically, I will argue, is that these parties, these mainstream parties, have shown a lack of responsiveness and differentiation. And they've sort of converged on policy and shown a policy consensus that open up the door to populists. So what does this European consensus look like? In Western Europe, basically beginning in the 1980s, you had this consensus about increasingly free market solutions to the problems of the state, to the problems of the fraying welfare network, and so on. In the 2000s, immigration is again viewed by this consensus as a problem, but almost a necessary one. And above all, the European Union is basically used as a depoliticizing agent. All kinds of problems are devolved to the European Union. And domestic politicians claim that basically, we can't possibly address the voters' problems because these issues are all addressed at the European Union level. And it's a great way to avoid blame, but it's also a great way to avoid responsibility. Above all, the left and right basically began to converge as a result. And so this is exemplified by the third way politics of the 1990s. Here with Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schroeder, and Tony Blair, as its main architects. Here they are again in a more affectionate moment. So this kind of convergence is happening in Western Europe, but it's also happening in the post-communist democracies as well. And here, there's first the consensus around liberal democracy and its institutions, which I think we'd all welcome. But there's also a consensus around market reforms. Research, for example, has shown that both left and right-wing governing parties in East Central Europe have systematically implemented the same kind of privatization, liberalization, market policies. There's no differentiation. And in the run-up to EU accession, this has really become sort of much more pronounced. Basically, the EU accession was viewed as an unalloyed good, and all kinds of compromises were made in order to achieve it. And elites, the mainstream political elites, stood shoulder to shoulder as one to demonstrate to the European Union the extent of support for the accession. And in many ways, this is understandable. It has its origins in this initial rejection of the communist system, both because there was a very strong conviction at the time that we simply could not go back, that we have to push forward, to markets and to democracy and the EU. And at the same time, because democratization in many places took place not through confrontation, but through elite negotiation and often reconciliation. And so there are these amazing scenes in 1989 of Alexander Dubček, the reform communist, meeting Václav Havel, the opposition leader, and embracing each other in this sort of gesture of an agreement that this is a new future for Czechoslovakia at the time. These images are incredibly stirring. Some are perhaps more stirring than others. This is Adam Michnik, the editor of one of the main newspapers in Poland, swigging back yet another vodka at a meeting of both opposition and Communist Party representatives back in '89. But the problem with convergence is that, as it's offered by the mainstream parties, is that from the voters' perspective, there's a lack of alternatives. Parties don't differentiate themselves. They don't offer different sort of policy programs to the electorate. It basically means a failure to respond to the voters. Voters perceive these parties as unresponsive and as unaccountable. And instead, what basically prevails is an image of these mainstream parties as basically governed by complacency. And this, of course, is exemplified by Donald Tusk, then the head of the Platforma, the main governing party in Poland until 2015. And his politics, his claim that what he wants from Poland is warm water from the tap, right? A continuation of a satisfactory status quo with no real innovation or change. But as Tusk and others were to find out, this status quo wasn't satisfactory at all. Because against this sort of elite consensus, against this sort of depolitization of domestic politics, populists basically were the main parties to criticize this kind of easy consensus. They viewed this party consensus, they viewed this elite agreement as prima facie evidence of an elite cartel, right? We keep telling you there's this elite cartel, and look, all these parties are doing exactly that. They're saying the same thing, they're all united, they're not different from each other. And they basically view a lot of the criticism is that what these elites do is to promote all kinds of self-serving institutions and policies. They view these consensus policies as highly problematic. So it's only the populists, and populists alone, who, for example, point out that the process of EU accession was largely that of capitulation. There were very few concessions that the member countries would basically allow the candidate countries. And they basically had to close one chapter after another of the negotiations in accordance with EU preferences, not their own. They also point out EU hypocrisy on issues such as corruption or ethnic minority rights, where the EU was demanding much more of the candidate countries than it itself was willing to provide. And they saw the EU accession as an attack on sovereignty, basically on national tradition. And so when you see our parties like Samoobrona, this is an early example, you can't have a talk on Polish populism without Andrzej Leper and his infamous tie choice. Where basically this party gets founded in the 1990s, it achieves almost no traction until the 2000s. And then in the run-up to EU accession, its critique really starts to bite. And it enters parliament, it enters the governing coalition. It eventually collapses, as many Polish parties do. But it does so on exactly this kind of a critique of the elite consensus as a selling out of the country's interests. The populists as critics also basically say that as a result, we need to better represent the popular will. And so they claim that they alone are responding to the electorate, and they alone will be held accountable for offering a different set of policies. They basically claim that they're going to represent the popular will, which, as it turns out, is also largely their own partisan self-interest. And this is where we come to the consequences of populists in office. because in the name of democratizing state institutions, in the name of moving closer to the people, they have actually eroded democracy, liberal democracy as we know it in East Central Europe. So what do populists do once they enter power? Well, here, the template is remarkably similar. And it holds in Poland, it holds in Hungary, it holds in Turkey, it holds in Venezuela. It's basically the same set of policies. They erode formal institutions of liberal democracy, of the rule of law. They attack the informal norms that turn out to be very important to keeping up and buttressing these formal institutions. And they divide society into good and bad, into loyal supporters and treasonous opponents. So first, with the formal institutions, the first target in all these cases is the judiciary. It's always the first target of populists. In Poland, this takes the place of basically an attack on the courts, where PiS packed the courts with new members, forced retirements, brought the courts under parliamentary control, which basically effectively ends independent judiciary in Poland, and required a court supermajority and lengthening the mandatory waiting period. This being Poland, the Supreme Justice of the Polish Supreme Court basically refused to accept her forced retirement and came back to work as if nothing had happened, and basically kept on going back to work day in and day out. We also see attacks on the media. And here in Poland, this has taken the form of the official state media, basically becoming a propaganda arm of the governing party. And at the same time, non-government media being excluded from parliamentary sessions, press conferences, and so on. In Hungary, it's even more insidious. There, basically, the government has bought out, or its allies have bought out most of the newspapers and other media. And the ones who are favored basically get enormous amounts of funding from the state, of advertising buys. Those who are not are basically left to wither away. And so at this point, there's one free newspaper left in Hungary. In Hungary, we also see attacks on civil society and the universities as yet another sort of, independent locus of intellectual and political power. Central European University in Hungary, for example, got booted out last year as a result of a law that specifically targeted that university. And in Hungary, again, what we also see are massive wholesale changes to the legal framework. Within 6 months of taking power, Fidesz basically rewrote the constitution from top to bottom, changing the electoral laws and ensuring that it would be favored basically as an incumbent for the foreseeable future. In both Poland and elsewhere, we also see informal norms being undermined. The first of this is that of the opposition, rather than being seen as a vital part of any functioning liberal democracy, is criticized and dismissed. That these are sort of, traitors, they're not loyal, they're not real Poles. The media is denounced and its access is limited. There's greater politicization of administration, something that had always taken place in these new democracies, but is now basically subject to an ideological purity test. And an erosion of what Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt would call the norms of tolerance and forbearance. Those are basically largely being eroded by these parties and their rhetoric. But these parties also basically go after the politics of identity, right? And they try to divide society into the good and the bad. The opposition, as I said, is basically traitorous, and only certain groups belong to the real nation. That's sort of the redefining project that these parties engage with. This reimaging of national history and values goes as far back as this. So for Kaczynski, this image of a somewhat rowdy reconciliation between opposing elites in 1989 Poland is evidence of exactly the elite cartel that I was earlier describing. These are sort of, communists and their sort of brethren liberals, basically, selling out Polish national interests. He views the entire post-89 order as tainted, as a democracy that's shot through with communist legacies and is therefore not acceptable and has to be changed, basically to comport with his desires. At the same time, beyond this critique, PiS has also aligned itself with a conservative religious vision of Poland. There's a de facto coalition with a sort of religious conservative movement of Father Tadeusz Rydzyk, portrait here, who leads a powerful traditionalist Catholic movement, and who benefits directly from this coalition. He, for example, once threatened to form his own political party because PiS was not forthcoming with enough state subsidies. As soon as he threatened that, he received all the subsidies that he had requested, and then some. So it's an uneasy coalition, but one that nonetheless benefits the parties. Together, this religious movement and PiS have battled against what they call gender ideology. Here it is genderism, a dangerous disease of the 21st century, against sex education in schools, and against LGBT rights. Here, this was an attempt this summer to create zones free from gay people, basically. These are stickers distributed by a government-affiliated newspaper until a court made them stop. A new law in May was supposed to fight pedophilia, but there were no provisions to include priests, who started serving the whole scandal. And that's because, as explained here by peace parliamentarian Bernadetta Krynicka, a pedophile priest is also a human being and deserves to make mistakes. She is also notorious for, in 2018, very arrogantly walking away from the mother of a handicapped child in a wheelchair who wanted to ask her questions about the government's proposals for caretaker subsidies for disabled children. But the broader point here is that this is a waging of a cultural war on multiple fronts that establishes peace as the party of real Poles and excludes those who do not support it. It's kind of a rethinking of the national the imaginary and a rethinking of national history. So in short, Poland exemplifies this illiberal template in many ways. There are attacks on the institutions of monitoring of oversight, there's the undermining of democratic norms, and there's redefining the people to basically be the party constituency. And all of this is designed to keep these parties in power. If there are no institutions of monitoring oversight, if the opposition is summarily dismissed, and if the real people are only the ones who support the party, all of that works together to keep these parties as incumbents in government. But at this point, we have this interesting puzzle. So given that, why is that Hungary has turned out to be so much more authoritarian and so much more kleptocratic? How is it that Poland hasn't traveled so far down that road? And I think there's one obvious and one non-obvious answer. The obvious answer is the concentration of power. In Hungary, you have 2/3 of a parliamentary majority, which is enough to basically rewrite the constitution. In Poland, the governing party only has a regular majority, which means that it can't rewrite the constitution. But there's another problem here, or another sort of factor here, and that's elite skills. Orban basically has a team of trained lawyers, and himself is intensely charismatic, even if that photo didn't make him look so. And so, these are the guys who basically were ready when they were elected in 2010, with basically a ready-made sort of, set of constitutional proposals. They knew all the enabling laws. They did this, with accordance with all the sort of legal norms, and they very precisely identified exactly what needed to be changed and to put themselves in power. In contrast, Kaczynski is surrounded more by yes men than by experts and has so little charisma that he himself didn't run for office, either in 2015 or 2019. And instead, when his party, for example, attempted to send forth the changes to the courts, they had to take them back and recall them several times because they would send one version to the Senate, another one to the parliament. There were some legal changes that didn't agree with each other and would contradict each other. So this is more of a shoestring operation than the one that we find in Hungary. And so while the two leaders are presented here as equals in the defense of Europe against the madness of the left and the Islamists, the reality is probably more like the satirical Ucho Prezesa, the chairman's ear, a program that describes an oddly familiar political party leader who is short in intelligence, but high basically on party organization. Now, against this background, how do you evaluate the elections of 2019? Well, on one hand, superficially, it would seem that Poland basically is continuing down its road. But I think there are glimmers of hope here. The first of this is, it is true that PiS has gained the share of the votes, but it has not gained more seats. And it hasn't gained more seats, despite the fact that it has spent billions of zloty on various social spending programs, including a wildly popular child subsidy, despite the fact that some of the largest state-affiliated companies gave it enormous financial assistance, and despite the fact that the state-run government television station basically did nothing but utter pro-peace propaganda throughout the pre-election period and the campaign. Further, the Senate is now in opposition hands. This has now been confirmed. The new Speaker of the Senate is a former Platforma politician. And PiS itself is no longer a homogeneous party. It contains three different factions. There's the Porozumienie, or the understanding of Jarosław Gowin. There's the Solidarna Polska, or Poland United of Zygmunt Ziobro, and the rest of the main PiS party. But that means that if either one of those two factions breaks off, PiS no longer has the majority that it now holds. And given sort of the long and storied tradition of Polish party politics, I think it's a safe bet that there'll be at least the temptation to do that in the next 4 years. My favorite glimmer of hope, our friend Bernadetta Krynicka, did not get reelected. She, in fact, placed 9th in the district. But the mother of the child in the wheelchair did get elected as an opposition parliamentarian. To cheer you up even further, support for democracy remains high across Europe. And here's Poland, at over 75%. And this isn't democracy in a very sort of loose sense. This was a Pew poll that specifically asked people about their commitment to the norms of liberal democracy, to the rule of law, to minority rights, to the free press, to courts, and so on. So support for democracy remains very, very high. Moreover, this is data that basically is the entire post-war period in Europe. Voters punish populist parties much more heavily than they punish other parties. So even though the mainstream may have failed and allowed the populists in, the populists basically are much more heavily punished by voters from election to election, largely because once in office, they fail to deliver in many ways on their promises. So in the end, I think Poland shows us three sort of main points about this global waves of populism. It shows us how mainstream complacency, this complacency of mainstream governing parties and their taken for granted attitude can lead to this surge, this upsurge of populists. It shows us how malevolence can sometimes be tempered by incompetence, in the immortal words of Benjamin Wittes. And above all, it shows us that democracy is not to be taken for granted. It's a process, it's not an achievement. It's a very fragile plant, and there are all too many forces who are eager to eat it. Thank you. Jason?
Bart, please.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here, both because the Zaleski Lecture is a highlight for me every year, but also because Anna Grzymała-Busse is a scholar who I've admired for many, many years, and I'm delighted to be able to comment on her lecture. I agree with everything Anna said, which makes my job a little difficult. But the good news is that I have not been tasked with a critique of her work, but rather I've been tasked with putting her lecture on Poland in a broader comparative setting, to talk about how Poland fits into the rise of populism, radical politics in Western Europe, the United States, and beyond. And so the question is, does East Central European radicalism require a distinct theory? And unlike most talks where I pose a question and the title, the answer from me is not necessarily no in this case. It's an open question. If pressed, I would probably say that we can actually come up with a theory that covers all the cases in question here. So, wait, am I doing this right? Yes, perfect. So as you know, the radical right, as many call it, is not just prevalent in Eastern Europe, but it's prevalent throughout the European continent and beyond. The cast of characters of politicians who represent radical right parties grows every year. Many of these faces will be familiar to you. But of course, they're also present in Eastern Europe. Of course, we've got our own homegrown radical right politician right here in the United States who's captured the Republican Party. And so this raises the question, two questions really. First, what is the radical right? And second, why now? I'm going to very briefly touch on these and hope to intersect with Anna's presentation toward the end of my talk. So first of all, the radical right has three components according to Kasmuda, and this is a definition that I've taken on as well. It has one component is populism, which we've heard about just now. The second component is nationalism, and particularly its exclusionary ethnic varieties. And third, authoritarianism, which we also heard about in the presentation. So I'm not going to get into a deep definition right now, but I'll just mention that populism really is a way of doing politics that opposes some sort of a corrupt elite with the virtuous people, as Anna just explained. When I say nationalism, what I mean by that are distinct understandings of what a nation is that constitute cleavages within national populations and often become the sources of deep political strife. What is Poland? What should Poland be in the future? What is Poland's history, which is something that we just heard about as well. And the third component is authoritarianism, and that is really a mode of governance, a way of governing once politicians on the radical right gain power, and a way of preserving power by violating democratic norms and democratic institutions. So we heard a lot about populism. I want to talk a little bit about nationalism. What I'm going to do is tell you, if you will indulge me for a minute, about a theoretical model that I've been developing for the rise of radical right politics in Western Europe, the United States, and perhaps also Eastern Europe. But the question I want to raise is whether this model works for Eastern Europe, or whether Eastern Europe or East Central Europe is distinctive enough that it requires its own model. And so the model is cultural. It brings together the supply side and demand side of politics, and it places nationalism at the center of the explanation. So on the supply side, you've got elite discourse, the kinds of frames that elites use in campaigns, for example. It includes nationalist frames, populist frames, and authoritarian frames quite often. On the demand side, you've got attitudes, right? People's beliefs. And I want to posit that nationalist cleavages are very important for understanding the rise of radical politics, but so is low institutional trust and anti-elitism, as we've been hearing. Now, it so happens that actually, in the aggregate, there's quite a lot of stability both on the supply and demand side. So the nationalist frames, populist frames have been around for a long time in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the United States. Similarly, people in most of these countries are not becoming more racist, more xenophobic, more Islamophobic over time, nor are they necessarily getting more anti-democratic, as we just heard. So there's a lot of stability. It's very difficult to explain change with stability. But underneath the stability, there are things happening. On the supply side, you've got elites recombining populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism in new ways and developing kind of a winning formula. On the demand side, you've got the sorting of nationalist beliefs, for example, between parties or party families, and the erosion of old identities. At the same time, and this is what Anna talked about as alternative explanations for the rise of radical politics, you've got a lot of change happening that's inducing anxiety and fear in domestic majorities. Those changes are economic, whether it's economic shocks or the offshoring of jobs or capital mobility. There are demographic changes, immigration, refugee crises, and so forth. There are terrorist, national security crises, terrorist attacks, and so forth. There's cultural change as well within kind of public culture. It's important to note that some of these changes are real, some of them are imagined and perceived, and they vary a lot. And so the presence of these causes varies a lot across cases, as we just heard. But what seems to me to be common is that elites take these shocks and they fuse them together in elite discourse, and they channel them toward outgroup resentment. So that if you're scared of economic changes, you're scared of immigration, you should really be blaming an outgroup, right? Either domestic minorities or immigrants. When that generates a sense of collective status threat among domestic majorities, it leads to the mobilization of otherwise latent nationalist cleavages and the support for radical right parties. Once the radical parties gain power, they impose all of the rules, the new changes that Anna was talking about when it comes to authoritarian governance. And then the model diffuses, right? We've seen this happen from country to country, where both the modes of governance diffuse and these formulas diffuse. So this is, again, a model that works quite well, I would argue, in Western Europe and the United States. And you can sort of fill in the gap, the boxes with specific case-specific examples. But the question is, does this model and do models like this also apply to East Central Europe? Or is East Central Europe distinctive enough that the model fails? So the question is, does Poland fit the mold based on what we heard today? There are commonalities, to be sure, between Poland and the United States and Western European countries when it comes to these things. So first of all, there is undoubtedly a great salience of nationalist politics in Poland today, right? As some have argued, there's anti-Semitism without Jews and Islamophobia without Muslims. Even though there are no notable domestic minorities in Poland, or they're very small, that discourse around them is loud and powerful. That discourse plugs into long-standing narratives that have divided the Polish nation for many, many decades and arguably centuries. You can pick your starting point where you like. One salient one is the interwar years, where you've got a debate between Endecja and Sanacja about what Poland ought to be, whether it, how homogenous or not it should be. You've got a great tension that persists throughout the decades and to this day between conservative Catholicism, which we heard about, and liberal cosmopolitanism, much as there are similar fissures in other countries. There are populist claims, anti-elite, pro-people claims that resonate with very deep anti-elite sentiments in the population and with low trust in government. There are perceptions of large-scale cultural change, which we also heard about around LGBTQ issues, for example. And there's the failure of mainstream parties, which was kind of the central thesis of Anna's talk. Other scholars have argued that similar failures have occurred in Western Europe and the United States as well. So Sherry Berman talks about the convergence of center left and center right around economic neoliberal policies, which then opens up the space for the radical right on cultural issues. Daniel Ziblatt has talked about the difficult place that center right parties are placed in when competing with the radical right, and they try to gain radical right voters often by mimicking the radical right. So there's clearly a failure of mainstream parties, again, across these cases. And finally, in Poland, we've got the adoption of authoritarian governance strategies, as we heard about, that Kaczynski borrowed quite liberally from Orban, who himself has drawn on Putin's strategies and Erdogan's and so forth, as Kim Shepley has written about. And although we don't see the same full-fledged authoritarianism in the United States and Europe, we certainly see aspirations towards similar authoritarianism, as President Trump often reminds us. But for all these commonalities, there are very deep differences as well, and particularities of the Polish case. First, as Anna mentioned, there's no sizable domestic ethnic minority in Poland that's competing for status against native-born Poles. So a lot of the exclusionary nationalism that is relevant in this case is sort of based on phantom fears. There was no economic crash. Poland fared well. There are no migration crises, as we also heard, and no major terrorist attacks. There's also a pretty unique fusion of nationalism with anti-LGBTQ ideology. And in fact, in many countries, you've got the opposite. Pro-LGBTQ ideology is used to further nationalist claims in Western and Northern Europe, for example. There's also a very uniquely East Central European feature of a persistent incumbent penalty. Very few parties in Poland and other Eastern European countries last more than one term, right? So there's this constant churn through the electoral process. And also, as a result of the post-communist moment, the lack of a viable left, because the left is tainted with a communist label. There's also the singular importance in Poland of the Smolensk airplane catastrophe that took the lives of multiple top-ranking government officials, including one of the Kaczynski twins. Obviously, a unique feature of the Polish context. But then again, the election of President Obama was a unique feature of the US context that's not duplicated anywhere else. And a little tidbit, the fact that PiS as a party challenges the very label of radical right? Because its economic policies are often redistributive and clientelistic in many ways. So economically, it's sort of leftist, but it combines that leftism with a social conservatism and authoritarianism and nationalism on the right. So this raises the question of whether radical right is even the right label. And finally, there's this unique feature which Monika Nalepa and others have written about, that PiS has benefited from what its predecessors did in terms of party reforms and electoral reforms. So the electoral reform 2001 made possible the gains of PiS in many ways. And so these are the unintended consequences of parties being self-serving when they're in office and then benefiting the radical right down the road. So the question is, are these unique properties of the case so great that you cannot fit this case and other East Central European cases into the broader framework of the rise of radical right politics? And again, I'm not sure what the answer is. I would argue that it's possible to bring East Central European countries into a broader comparative framework. If I were to press to do so, I would say that where the status threat in Poland comes from is the politics of disappointment, of this transition moment in the early 1990s when people thought that the world would change for the better. And instead what happened is their expectations came into a conflict with the reality of neoliberal free market reform. The growing inequality of the 1990s, which has stabilized over the 2000s, but in the 1990s you've got massive growth of top earners, wage dispersion, and so forth, and persistent urban-rural differences in development and well-being. There's the importance, which is really hard to capture empirically, of perceived threat. So that is, yes, there is no refugee crisis in Poland, and there are very few immigrants in Poland, but Poland is not a hermetically sealed unit, right? So Poles see what's happening elsewhere, and their politicians can say, look, if you don't elect us, you're going to have refugees at your doorstep too, just like they do in Southern Europe, right? So there is kind of a perception of what might be coming that allows national politics to thrive. There's also the erosion of old identities, whether labor identities, anti-communist identities, and the lack of forthcoming political solutions for the reasons that Anna talked about. And like elsewhere, this status threat is channeled into resentment against liberalism, against Jews, against Muslims, against fictive migrants, and all of this is fueled by a conservative Catholic Church. So there are different causes, because there are different causes in all of these cases, but I would argue that it's possible to come up with a theory that filters these causes through similar mechanisms, with then similar outcomes for the well-being of liberal democracy, as we heard. But that leaves some questions. So despite my best effort, can a single general theory cover the United States, Western Europe, and East Central Europe? Whether that theory is my theory, or Anna's theory, or other theories, or are these just such different settings that we should come up with separate explanations? And that's a question for Anna, it's a question for us to consider. If a theory of this sort is possible, what role does nationalism play in such a theory? So are the prime causes, let's say, party failure, do they lead to nationalist mobilization, which then leads to potentially authoritarian rule? Or do these prime causes, for instance, party failure, lead to populist mobilization that leads to authoritarian rule? Now, these are not mutually exclusive completely. Obviously, nationalist mobilization has a sprinkling of populist anti-elite discourse, or populist mobilization can then define the people in nationalist terms. But the question is, what's primary, right? These are different explanations. Is the primary cause the awakening of these long-standing nationalist cleavages, or is the prime cause the mobilization of anti-elite, anti-government sentiments? So that's an open question, and a question that we should struggle with in the Q&A, presumably. Also, how do we conceptualize the resulting parties that do combine populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism? Do we call them radical right? It's a problematic term because it assumes a single continuum, of ideological continuum, right? Where peace doesn't fit well. Do we call them all populist? It's a reasonable term, but also it privileges one aspect of the radical right over the other two, which is nationalism and authoritarianism potentially. So I don't actually have a very good answer to this, but it's something worth talking about. And finally, I was really happy to hear a happy ending in Anna's talk. It's very rare that talks on this topic have any optimistic news. And so that's great. One thing we should also think about is whether there is a path in Poland and other East Central European countries toward a meaningful alternative to both the center right and the radical right, and that is a progressive left. An option that's been foreclosed for some time in Poland, but perhaps there are some answers that are possible. And that would be a party that would offer redistribution, potentially meaningful economic and social justice platforms, but without engaging with ethno-nationalism that has become the mainstay of the radical right. So I'll end there, and I look forward to our discussion in the next while.
Thank you, Bart.
Thank you.
Okay, so here we are. I think that there are three basic questions on the table. So the first one is where populism is coming from in Poland. Mind you, this is the most successful recent case of political and economic transformation. Poland has one of the 5 fastest growing economies in the world for the last 30 years. Poland has inequalities lower than Germany. Poland has 5 times higher GDP per capita than it had at the beginning of transition. So it's definitely a tremendous success story. It will be in future books on economic development, pair with Taiwan and South Korea as a incredible tiger. So where populism is coming from in this sort of settings. Then we have the question how different Polish and East European populism is in comparison to other cases of populism, both in Europe and outside Europe. And finally, the question, what kind of populism it is? Is it national socialism? Is it something different? Is it radicalism of various sorts and so on? So here are the main questions, and I think you probably have additional set of questions as well. So let me open the floor for a series of questions and comments, and then we'll go back to Anna and to Bart. Yes, please.
I have a question. If there is an economic collapse in the world, will the consequences be terrible, lead to wars and such like, or will it solve this problem?
If you could mention your name. Could you introduce yourself? Sorry, I didn't.
Busse, a physicist.
Let's. Shall we take a couple of more? Paula.
Thanks. Paula Charnish, MIT. So I'm curious if we interpret populism as a failure of mainstream parties, if we can still make kind of predictions of what type of voters will be particularly demanding a party like the Populist Party, and maybe for understanding what type of voters, actually more conventional explanations, economic inequality or cultural, will be more useful.
Thank you. I'm Liz Sherwood Randall, and I appreciated both of your presentations so much. I'm interested in the distinction you've made between the Hungarian case and the Polish case, in particular because of the question in my mind that neither of you engaged, which is what about outside influence and pressure that it permeates a country and potentially causes populist elites to pursue a certain path which may be inimical to democratic interests. And in the case of Hungary, I can see a very clear set of influences. And so I wonder if you could engage this question of where in the models is the variable of outside influence and its endeavor to divert from a democratic path to something that is anti-democratic.
I'm Tom Symons. I'm a retired diplomat. And my question is a question within the question, because Poland, and confined to Poland, Poland had a peace government from 2005 to 2007. It was in coalition with the peasants. It was not very successful, and it was voted out and left peacefully. Then Poland weathered the succeeding economic crisis pretty well. I think GDP didn't drop at all, so that probably isn't a major factor in the return of peace in 2015, even stronger. Now it has these majorities, these super majorities. What explains the difference? The strengthening of peace over that period. Is it only Smolensk? I mean, you mentioned Smolensk, and if it is only Smolensk, why did that have such a powerful impact to bring this more radicalized peace into power?
Okay, so we have a few questions. Let me go back to other questions.
But first on the question here, if there is an economic disaster, I think it might sweep some of these parties from power. It might, if there's an economic recession, it might sweep peace from power in the longer term and President Trump from power in the shorter term. I don't think it's going to end in disaster. The Europeans weathered the 2008 and 2010 economic crises, and it didn't end in disaster. So I don't think it's, the prognosis is all that dire. Then comes to Wilhelm's question about the voters. So populist voters for right-wing populist parties tend to follow a very similar profile. They tend to be more conservative on sort of the left-right dimension. They tend to be older. They tend to be less well-educated, and they tend to be more religious. So they're a little bit to the right of the median voter, but they're not that unusual. And I think what ties them is something that we haven't talked about, and it's kind of a peculiar dimension to talk about in social science. But this sort of need for dignity. Right? If you listen to sort of peace voters, what they say over and over again is that these prior governments totally dismiss us. They didn't listen to us, they didn't take us seriously. This is what you hear from voters in so-called flyover country, right? The elites never took us seriously. And here's a party that addresses these voters' concerns, actually gives them something tangible in the form of a child subsidy that makes an enormous amount of difference to many middle-class families, and treats them seriously. And that, is something that I think a lot of politicians tend to ignore, and peace, Trump and others have taken the pains to do. To Liz's question about Hungary and international influence, I think in all these cases, populism is very much a homegrown problem. Orban had already started to make this shift in the mid-1990s. There was just a question, he was given this enormous gift of his predecessor, basically, a week after getting into power in 2006, being caught saying on tape that we have lied to the citizens night and day about how bad the economic situation is, and we lied to them so we could get elected. And you can imagine the kind of political hay you can make of that. So they come to power in 2010, and they have everything ready, and because they come in with a supermajority, they immediately implement it. International influence wasn't necessary for any one of those steps to take place. Now, of course, they're facing some pressure from the European Union, but it's toothless. Mostly because Hungary's in the European People's Party, and Manfred Weber has taken great pains to protect its standing and protect it from censure. And finally, on the question of
But I'm sorry, that actually is not the point I was making. So I was speaking about pernicious influence, and it is relevant in the Polish case too. I was speaking about Russia and the endeavor that it was quite deliberate to shape outcomes in Eastern European countries, remains deliberate actually, and whether that's a factor in either of these cases. And as I've seen them, it has had different impacts in both countries. Smolensk actually is a fascinating case in and of itself with respect to the Russian role. We can talk about that, but that's what I was aiming for, was, is that a variable in your analysis, whether there is a deliberate effort to undermine democracy from outside?
So as I mentioned at the top, I think yes, absolutely, Russia would like nothing better than all these pro-these democracies to become destabilized, but it can't form a political party, right? So that homegrown
Though it can support it.
Sure, but that homegrown populism has to be there. And in many cases, when the revelations come that it's funding a different political party or it's forming an agreement, those are so controversial that there's backlash. So it's not clear that, Russia would very much like to intervene and interfere, and it certainly has tried to do so. It's not clear that this somehow, leads to greater popular support for the populist parties at all. None of these among the voters. And finally, to this question of, the difference between peace of 2005, 2007 and the peace of 2015 to today. The difference is simple. They're governing without a coalition. The party was tempered. Its sort of ability, I don't think its commitments had changed at all. The difference is that now they're governing without a coalition partner, and they can do what they want. In 2005, 2007, it was a very unstable coalition. They constantly had to make compromises and concessions, and their stay in office ended because the coalition fell apart due to these two very unreliable partners. So it's basically just the concentration of power and the ability to do so much more when you're the single party governing.
But why did they get this tremendous majority? I mean,
so again, I think this is sort of the complacency of Platforma, which basically enters politics in 2008 and then promptly basically checks out, right? And so there's some sort of, there's always another reform that was coming down the pike. None of them were successful, none of them were fully implemented. And for Tusk to actually say that he's just happy with a satisfactory status quo as his big offering to Poland was seen as a slap in the face by a lot of voters. The same voters who then sort of felt like the elites weren't speaking to them and weren't listening.
Bart?
As usual, I agree. Maybe go backwards. I think the other factor that may be relevant is, yes, the Smolensk catastrophe gave them a lot of discursive ammunition, but also the fact that Poles saw the rise of radical right parties elsewhere matters, right? That it was sort of, they could aspire to also have their own stronger, homegrown radical right party, and peace met that demand quite well. So I think it's a combination of coalition politics and a different sort of situation, different context. On the Russia question, sure. I mean, the Russian disinformation campaigns are operating in multiple countries. They're certainly operating in the United States, and it plays some role. It's very hard to put an exact kind of point estimate on what an impact it has on any particular election outcome. But I think it's all too easy to dismiss, again, domestic factors and just say, oh, it's Russia's fault. Russia's disinformation tactics would not work if there wasn't already a ripe soil for that in each of these countries, if there weren't already cleavages within the populations, if there weren't already anxieties and fears that could be exploited by opportunistic domestic politicians. So there may be some additional role that this is playing, but it's very hard to know just how much. But certainly Russia is trying. That's definite. Voda, so I think this is where nationalism becomes really important, because a lot of the voters have very particular understandings of what the nation is, what it means, which are consistent with the messaging of a lot of these radical right parties that are promising a more homogenous nation, a nation in the Polish case for straight, white, males, or at least people who believe in a particular gender ideology. So I think that's really important. Also, this notion of the left behind, I think, is absolutely right. This is partly to do with education. In a lot of the countries, there's growing sort of premium to tertiary education, and those who don't have it are feeling left behind. Peter Hall has written on this with Noam Gudron. And actually, that kind of a situation leads to support for both left populism and right populism. So, in Poland, that certainly had been the case that over the course of the 1990s, the wage premium to tertiary education increased radically over that period of time. And then in terms of the global crash, sure, if that happened, who knows, it would be sort of uncharted water in some ways. But at the same time, we saw what happened in the previous economic crisis, and chances that there'd be some similarity to that situation. And my intuition is that, the incumbents would get punished. So to the degree that there is a radical right incumbent like Trump or Kaczynski in Poland, they would likely lose support. And to the degree that there's a center-left or center-right incumbent, they would lose support and potentially benefit the radical right. So it's sort of, I don't know if there's an easy linear trend that one could predict if there was another major global economic crisis.
So we have the second round. Yes. And then Peter.
Which is whether those theories apply equally well for Eastern Europe and the rest of the world, Western Europe. I think both theories are very comprehensive. I think Eastern Europe fits pretty well. What is unique about Eastern Europe, I think, are, at least two things. The one is just the post-communist context and this politics of disappointment, and this just even when successful, this economic and political changes were very traumatic in the sense that these changes were very quick. So this and the hopes were very high. So this created kind of an atmosphere which Western Europe did not necessarily, or the US hasn't, there is no equivalent to that. And then, and I would say that for that, also because these democracies are younger and the institutions and the norms are also less established, they're in a way a harbinger. For what is happening in the older democracies. So in that sense, that also kind of fits. And then the third thing I would say is that even though with this idea of phantom threats of immigration particularly, I would say that the way in which Poland and Hungary and the rest, I guess, are so in all these countries, even though immigrants haven't come in the way that they have in Germany or elsewhere, there is still the threat, the perceived threat of demographic change in that people are leaving, especially young and educated, and also just the population growth is low. So in that sense, there is the sense that we are disappearing even without people like outsiders coming in. So.
Thank you. Peter.
I want to ask two questions. The first one is very much of this, very much of the sort of the comment we just heard. This notion of the politics of disappointment. I mean, to what extent do you think that it mattered that the transition, not just to democracy, but to capitalism, took place at the height of neoliberal exuberance, the height of a sense that the route to prosperity was through highly competitive market mechanisms? One could have disappointment even without that, but I wonder, as Wade Jacoby has argued this, I think, and I wonder whether you think that feeds into the East Central European cases at all. And my second question, it takes off from a point that Barb made, and Anna, your comment about dignity, which intuitively seems to me a very important observation. And it leads me to wonder, in your schema, these were wonderful presentations, I learned a lot from both of them, but in your schema where a lot of the blame, so to speak, lies with these converging elites, and I think you're right about that, I wonder if you don't need to add to that somehow a sense that, notwithstanding Grzegorz' economic data, Grzegorz is a well-known materialist when it comes to these issues. Notwithstanding Poland's enormous economic success, it wasn't a kind of success that created manifest winners and losers. And do we see that in support for peace? Do we see it in a sort of urban-rural divide, for instance, in the electoral results? In other words, of course it's a paradox. It can't be pure economic failure that somehow leads to these things, certainly not in East Central Europe. But what about a distributive economic failure? Doesn't that play into this more than we might otherwise think?
Professor Elliott.
Mark Elliott, East Asian Studies and History Department. I'm waiting for the introduction of the church as a structural factor.
Have you come to the right place?
Explaining this. I mean, Bart gave us a bunch of examples of how Poland fits and then doesn't fit, but the presence of the church was not there in your list. At least I don't remember seeing it in that list of things. And where the part of the world that I study, you have definitely nationalism, you certainly have authoritarianism, not so much populism. And then the nationalism is partly an ethno-nationalism and partly a nostalgic nationalism, which is a term I'm sure you're both very familiar with. And in that regard, I wonder in the Polish case, if nostalgia, Wojna Ojczyzna, and all that kind of thing doesn't play into it, and the particular power that, I'm not a Europeanist, so I don't know, but it seems to me that in the Polish case, the church is unusually influential in public life in a way that it used to be in many countries of Europe, and for the most part isn't anymore, with that one important exception. So I'd be interested in thoughts.
Thank you, Mark. This one more question.
So my name is Zoltán Ádám. I'm a visiting scholar here at CIS, and I'm actually from Hungary. And I would like to make some comments on your presentations and to some extent debating them. So first of all, actually Hungary and Fidesz in particular seems to be a counterexample to your discourse, because it's not a new party. It's been around for 30 years. So it's actually the example in which an existing mainstream right-wing political party responds to perhaps changing, perhaps not that changing, demand of voters. And to a large extent, actually, Trump can be mentioned as well, who, of course, takes over the Republican Party, but the Republican Party remains to be the Republican Party, and as such exemplifies, again, a response to changing voter preferences. So I'm not that sure if the negligence or the non-responsiveness of mainstream parties is the explanation for populism, because in some cases they do respond, and the result is still populism, authoritarian populism. This is point number one. Point number two is that, of course, there's an enormous change in terms of institutions and in terms of norms during this responding process by these populist parties. And I just would like to mention that there is, in the literature on populism, there is this distinction between inclusive and exclusive populisms. And this change in terms of norms and institutions many times coincides with a certain degree of inclusiveness. And this also makes these populist parties very powerful. So if you look at Hungary in terms of social policies, if you look at peace in terms of social policies, the child benefit being mentioned, there's a great degree of inclusiveness that was not there before, and I think plays an important role, responding to some demand of the voters which was not met by the actual policies before. And following on that, I would just like to mention that of course it's a kind of conundrum that Poland is being a successful country and to a large extent East Central Europe in general being a successful place in the world in terms of economic changes. Of course there's a great degree of variation, but still. But of course there's this fallacy of picking the wrong unit of analysis, so to speak. So those voters who do vote for peace, for Fidesz, may not be the winners. And they don't have to be actually, objectively speaking, losers. It's enough if they see themselves to be the losers and see themselves to be excluded by previous politics. And in that sense, I think East Central Europe is actually not that different from Western Europe or from America. To a great extent, this authoritarian populist political discourse is a supply for self-proclaimed losers.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to our...
In 30 seconds or less. So Peter, to address the question of what are the politics of disappointment? So the old joke is that in 1989, when East Europeans were promised democracy, they were thinking Sweden, right? And that means not just a liberal democracy, but a very extensive welfare state and enormous amounts of income equality, right? And they got the first. They certainly didn't get the second two. And I think that's the disappointment. That somehow, and this leads back to the comment about the distributional issues. Because there is a rural-urban split, certainly in Poland, certainly in Hungary. And that leads, to, of course, again, the politics of disappointment, of being left behind, of not being taken seriously, of basically, being one of the neglected ones. And that's certainly what peace has played on. And this child subsidy, one of the huge benefits of it is that it is not need-based. It went to everyone except single mothers, because of course that flies in the face of the sort of traditional conservative social stance. But it basically went to everyone, right, rural and urban. And so the first time these were policies that were being delivered, as if people were equal, and that made an enormous difference, not just because of the money, but because of the way that the policies were being delivered. On the question of the church, so this is a minor obsession of mine. So thank you so much for bringing it up. But I think that actually brings up a really interesting. There are 2 points I would want to make about the church. First of all, it's not a monolith. So, Father Rydzyk represents one sort of extreme, sort of conservative, nationalist, populist end of the church. There are plenty of those within the church who are worried about what this means and what this kind of close political alignment might mean for the future of the church in Poland. The second thing to say is that what the church does, I think, is nicely illustrate the difference between nationalism and populism. because the church is extremely nationalistic. And, in fact, there's this easy equation of Catholic equals Pole that pervades the Polish national consciousness, and the church is more than happy to encourage it. The church feels very differently about populism. There, it's much more mixed, and it's much more hesitant about either engaging in populist politics or the kind of policy consequences it has. So during the immigration crisis, for example, it was certainly the mainstream church that was coming out in favor of accepting immigrants and reminding people of their Christian duty, reminding them of the duty to be generous and to be charitable. And that actually generated a conflict with the politicians who basically told the church to stop talking. So there's room for, I think, much more nuance than just the church would have it. And finally, on your point about Fidesz, I totally agree. Fidesz was, as I pointed out, a mainstream. It was a liberal party when it was founded in 1989. It was the alliance of young Democrats, for heaven's sake. And so it made that shift relatively early on in the 1990s. And I think this is the political genius of Orban. He saw what was on the horizon, right? And just conservative Christian appeals weren't going to cut it. But nationalism and populism were. And as I said, he greatly benefited from having this fantastic adversary that basically fell on its own sword and imploded in 2006. And I think so I think that's where I would leave it. And I agree with you about the other points. So we're not actually debating.
Right, and that's a common feature of many of the country cases, that the parties that we now classify as radical right populist often started in very different ways, right? Some of them were neoliberal, some of them were Eurosceptic. Many of them have been around for a good 30, 40 years, but over time, they arrived at this kind of new formula of combining populist, nationalist, and authoritarian claims in ways that work. And they borrowed from one another along the way. So, yeah, I don't see that as in any way contradictory with Anna's presentation or the way I think about this problem. I think the politics of disappointment and nostalgia can go together, actually, and I think Peter, you're absolutely right that the fact that the transition happened at the height of neoliberalism led to the shock therapy that a lot of Eastern European countries experienced, which delivered a very different set of conditions than people had hoped for. Right, exactly as Anna was saying, they had hoped for greater equality, for a strong safety net, and they didn't get that. Which then left them open to blame the same groups they've been blaming for decades, right? It's the Jews, Muslims were sort of a new entry into the categories of outgroups that were being blamed, but also Russian conspiracies and all the old monsters reemerged, right? And these narratives have been around for a very long time. So they're fueled by disappointment. They're fueled by fear, and the result is nationalist populist politics. As far as the church goes, I think I didn't mention it very briefly, but really Anna's the expert on the Polish Catholic Church. I think it's a unique feature of the Polish case, of course. But there are parallels to it that are not religious elsewhere, right? So one of the things that the church does has a very powerful megaphone for amplifying nationalist claims. Well, in the United States, you don't have an exact parallel, although the evangelical Christian denominations serve some of that role. But you've got other organizations like Breitbart, like the extreme right, that also has a strong, loud megaphone that can amplify nationalist claims. So I think that the specific channels through which some of this discourse makes an impact vary across countries. And the church in Poland is, one type of Christianity is particularly influential when it comes to politics.
Let me follow on a part of this discussion. I think we've mentioned several times already that a lot of people are disappointed in the region, and we said that indeed there are some losers in the region as well. Now, I would like to bring Timothy Gartonash, who in this recent project he's working on, uses the term of deficit of attention and respect. Now, is it about disappointment or is it about respect? Now, we can really exactly know how people feel in Poland, in some other countries, because the public opinion polls are telling us this with great precision. So, for example, when people are asked, how is your family life? How is the standard of living of your family today? 80% of Poles are saying today that my standard of living of my family is just absolutely great. And those who are disappointed are in single digits, right? The same is about asking about the economic situation. How is your economic situation? And again, 70% polls say it's perfectly okay, with the single digit saying it's terrible. Security issue, right? 90% of polls are saying that they feel absolutely secure in the country, no problem whatsoever, against single digits. Now, 50 or 40% of people are voting for peace, right? So these are not the disappointed people, right? So there is something else going on, and the question of respect may be closer to where the real problem is than the idea of disappointment.
Dignity.
That's right.
Yeah, let's open. Yes, please.
Yes, Christopher, I'm a former teacher and French diplomat, so I feel in a neutral field here. Polish and not American. Well, I have a question about the difference between the situation in Poland and in Hungary. It seems to me, I've been working 3 years for the embassy in Warsaw, and it seems to me quite different. I would say you saw that Orban Putin visited recently Orban in Budapest. It's not possible in Warsaw. And for me, the relationship with Russia means something very important. 1 point. That's 2 points. It means that for me, Russia is the perfect model of kleptocracy. Putin wants to control media, justice, and police just to avoid. He's one of the richest men in the world. They are stealing that's tremendous in Russia. And Orban is just a little bit on this way. He wanted power for his team. And there's a corruption in Hungary. I'm not sure that peace, maybe there's corruption very small everywhere, but I don't mean it's the goal. The goal is, and it's connected with the church, it's mainly ideological, to have an influence in the Endacja tradition, which is nationalist and democratic and church and Catholic, Polak Catholic. And that's completely different with Hungary, for me. Because I was in Hungary, the church are quite empty, as in France. So I feel a bit different. And the second point, it always sounds strange to me, the argument that they don't want migrants, but there's no migrant. But we are in the globalization, television and media moment since 70 years. So what's happening in Australia? It's immediately in the French media. So it's not a very valuable argument. One of my friends, Krakow, told me, I don't want Krakow to be like Marseille. I don't want 50% of African in Krakow. And I think it's maybe not the only, maybe it's a part of explanation of this. Poles and also Czech and Slovak and Lithuanian and Romanian don't want multiculturalism. There's one word I haven't heard here. They are against multiculturalism. That's why there's no economic crisis, no immigrant movement, but they are afraid. Because, sorry, I'm French, and when I saw 4 days ago on Sunday, the leftist Mélenchon, the leader of the trade unions, with Islamists shouting Allahu Akbar, it's a shock for me in center of Paris. That's a threat. And the Poles don't want that threat in Warsaw.
Thank you very much.
For me, it's an explanation.
Ogden Ross. So my concern is that during the 30s, there were similar populist movements that were rising, and that ultimately they became consolidated in right-wing parties. I don't know if they were exactly called radical right. I'm a little confused about the use of the word radical, because usually radical is referred to the left, like especially in the 60s. It was always the radicals who were on the left, not on the right. But the rights were reactionaries to the left. And this environment seems to be more reactionary to the left. Except that the anomaly is that Hitler used social democracy combined with nationalism which is sort of a way of, this is a populist way of saying, well, let's coordinate our activities together, and then, we'll form a new sort of economy based on this idea. And then all of a sudden, they expanded. And Poland was like the first to be expanded into, other than Stetland, and partly because Poland was very unprepared. And I wonder if Poland is not being underprepared now, that the prosperity has sort of led to an environment in which they're a bit complacent towards what's actually going around surrounding them, because they're so central and they're so easily invaded from all sides.
More questions, comments, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Friederike Römer. I'm a JFK scholar at the CES. And I have a question in regard to the response of mainstream parties to populist challenges. And mainstream parties can react in different ways to populist parties entering the discourse. And I was wondering whether you could say something about, is there a systematic difference how mainstream parties reacted in Eastern European countries as compared to Western European countries?
I just ask a second question, which takes off from Grzegorzy's point. I remember at the Center for European Studies here, we had, shortly after the accession, the first accession of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary to the European Union, we had a number of ministers from those countries talking. I remember one of them took me aside after some panel and said, from the Czech Republic, took me aside and said, those West Europeans think that we have to conform to their image of Europe. But now that we're in, they're going to have to conform to our image of Europe. I detected in that and in many other things a sense, very ironic, given the extent to which these parties are supported by the agricultural subsidies from the European Union, but nonetheless a very ironic sense that West Europeans tend to regard us as second-class citizens, and I wonder whether there's any evidence or even intuitions that fuels the nationalism that in turn, a kind of transnational status concern, if you like, that makes one feel, quote unquote, left behind in Europe, even notwithstanding one's enormous economic success, et cetera, in the East.
Last chance for...
We can't take a little more.
Okay.
So, Peter, I think there is some of that sense. It hasn't been systematically exploited, but you do hear these little flare-ups. For example, it turns out that the same companies sell food of very different qualities in the East and in the West, and that, of course, gets ramped up, right? As another sort of point on, was the EU really worth it, right? But it's absolutely the case that, Fidesz could not function, and neither could PiS, without the enormous structural funds that are flowing. I mean, Hungary is getting something like €3 billion year in, year out, which is an enormous amount. So they're basically entirely, no, not entirely, but they're largely dependent on that largesse to be able to deliver the goodies. On the question of the mainstream party response, so, the big difference between East and West is that in the East, they're in government. In the West, they're not, with the exception of being a junior partner in Austria and governing in Greece. And so what happens is, precisely because of the kind of churn that Bart was describing, in the East, once these parties get into government and change the institutions to ensure their longer-term hold on the incumbency, combined with sort of the general weakness of political parties in the newer democracies of East Central Europe, it's much harder for mainstream parties to mount any kind of a response, much less effective electoral campaigns. In the West, on the other hand, we see all kinds of, the Austrian government fell when it became clear that the Freedom Party leader was involved in basically, selling out to Russia. In Greece, they erected they basically, the New Democracy won the recent election and Syriza is out. In Italy, they erected a cordon sanitaire around Salvini, right, who's attempting to bring down the government and basically entrench himself further. So I think in the West, the response is sort of, is largely predicated on the fact that these are not long-term governing parties, and these are not governing parties that have been able to basically change the institutional framework, whereas in the East they are, and that makes the response much, much harder. And then very briefly, on the question of, it is absolutely the case that there's a massive cultural threat that's being perceived. And it's not the reality of how many immigrants you accept. It's, basically seeing masses of people land, willy-nilly on the shores of, and of overcrowded refugee camps and all of that, right? And, the images from Hungary in the summer of 2015 were broadcast on Polish TV constantly. So it's clear that that plays a role, even if no immigrants actually arrive. And I think, to your question, I think what you've pointed to nicely is the difference between populism and other authoritarian ideologies. Because unlike either fascism or communism, populism is not a thick, coherent ideology. It doesn't have a systematic prescription for what to do in the future. It merely argues against what is there now, and it argues, elites bad, people good. Whereas both fascism and communism are very coherent, and they have a clear sort of and systematic prescription for what to do in the economy, in the polity, and in society. And that makes populism sort of, much more compatible with all kinds of ideologies, but it also makes it much weaker.
Grzegorz, to respond to your question about survey questions about how your family's faring, this is often the case that supporters of radical right parties are individually doing okay, but if you ask them sociotropic questions, is the nation going in that right direction? Are you worried about people like you? All of a sudden worries come up, right? And you see the same in the United States. A lot of Trump supporters are doing just fine, right? They're living suburban lives, middle class, but they're worried that people like them are going to lose, right? And also the other dimension of it is the nationalist distinctions. And so, peace supporters imagine a very different Poland than supporters of alternative parties. To come back to Peter and maybe the question about cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism. So what's interesting in the Polish case is that support for the EU is really high, even among peace supporters. But the question is, what kind of a Europe are these people sort of imagining? And it's not the Europe of cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism, right? It's a Europe of nations. It's a Europe of nations that have strong sovereignty and control over their own population. In fact, a lot of people see the radical right succeeding elsewhere, and they're joining the club. They're joining a European club of radical right governments or at least strong parties. So I think there is a European dimension here, but it's of a Christian white Europe, of which Poles feel very much a part, particularly among the peace supporters. And I think somebody asked about the role of Russia at some point. I can't remember if it was this round of questions or earlier, and the very different role that Russia plays in Hungary versus Poland. Right. Well, that was about more the Russian disinformation tactics, but I was thinking more about ideological alignments. And it's very true, as Anna was saying during her talk, that anti-Russian sentiments are very strong in Poland. One cannot imagine the visit of Putin to Poland and so forth. You asked about that. And that's absolutely right. And what's fascinating is that this comes back to the fact that populism is not an ideology in its own right, and neither is authoritarianism. Although Kaczynski, unlike Orban, has no interest in Putin, or is very negative toward Putin, Kaczynski has no problem borrowing tactics from Orban to stay in power, right? And that's where all of a sudden authoritarian governance strategies can be attached to any ideology. Anti-populist claims can be attached to any ideology. And so that both of those things travel across actors, across countries, even if those actors disagree fundamentally on ideology. And so we see the diffusion of these strategies across countries over time.
I think that we'll discuss those issues for a few more times in the future. So please join me to thank Anna and Bart for this fascinating discussion.